The bridge of the DES Dominance fell silent as another red warning light blinked out on the tactical display. Fleet Commander Vextar's four eyes tracked the disappearing signal with the resignation of someone who had watched too many lights go dark over the past 72 hours. The Void Swarm had claimed another frigate, adding the ZFS Relentless to their growing list of casualties. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at the rear observation deck, her human frame dwarfed by the towering Zephyrian officers around her. She had been aboard the massive dreadnought for exactly 18 hours, and in that time she had watched the supposedly impregnable Third Fleet lose 6 capital ships and countless smaller vessels. The mathematics were simple and brutal. At this rate of attrition, the entire battle group would be space debris within a week. Status report. Vextar's voice carried the weight of his species' natural authority, though Sarah detected something else underneath. A tremor that suggested even the unflappable Zephyrians were beginning to crack. Sub-Commander Kexmol, a being that looked like a cross between a mantis and a tree, consulted his bioluminescent display panel. "Sir, we've lost contact with Battle Group 7 and 9. The Void Swarm has penetrated our outer defensive perimeter. Current projection shows complete strategic collapse within 96 hours. Sarah winced. The Zephyrians had a habit of stating catastrophic news with the same emotional inflection most people used to order coffee. She supposed that after ruling a galactic empire for 3,000 years, you developed a certain clinical detachment to disaster. "And our allies?" Vextar inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The Korthak Republic has withdrawn their remaining forces to defend their homeworld. The assembled minds have gone into full defensive mode. They're sealing their space entirely, the Crystal Collective." Kexmol paused, his mandibles clicking in what Sarah had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of clearing his throat. "The Crystal Collective has declared the sector mathematically unsalvageable and departed for the Outer Rim." The bridge erupted in a series of clicks, whistles, and harmonic tones. Zephyrian profanity, Sarah assumed. She had been studying their language for 6 months, but hadn't quite mastered their more colorful expressions. Fleet Commander Vextar turned his attention to Sarah, all 4 of his eyes focusing on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Lieutenant Chen, you have been observing our tactics for the past day. I am curious. What does Terra's representative make of our situation?" Sarah had been dreading this moment. As the only human in the sector, she was supposedly there as an observer and strategic consultant, though everyone knew the real reason. Earth wanted a witness to record how galactic civilization ended. The Terran Confederation was too small and too new to meaningfully contribute to a war of this magnitude, but they could at least document it for future reference. "Sir, with respect," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully, "I think you're all approaching this wrong." The bridge fell completely silent. Even the constant hum of the ship's systems seemed to quiet down, as if the Dominance itself was holding its breath. A junior officer dropped what appeared to be a crystalline datapad, and the sound of it shattering on the deck was unnaturally loud. Vextar's head tilted in a gesture Sarah had learned indicated confusion mixed with potential offense. "Explain." Sarah took a deep breath. She had spent her entire military career being told to observe and learn from her superiors, but everything she had seen over the past day suggested that the combined wisdom of 7 galactic civilizations was about to get them all killed. Sometimes she figured you had to speak up. "The Void Swarm doesn't fight like any known species," she said, stepping forward toward the main tactical display. "Your strategies are all based on fighting other civilizations, beings with logic, goals, and self-preservation instincts. But these things..." She gestured at the display showing the seething mass of biomechanical entities consuming everything in their path. "They're more like a natural disaster than an enemy army." Kexmol's bioluminescent patches flared in what Sarah recognized as indignation. "Lieutenant, our tactical algorithms have been refined over millennia. We have analyzed every possible strategic approach to this conflict. Have you tried not fighting them?" The question hung in the air like a discordant note. Sarah could practically feel the collective intelligence of the bridge struggling to process what she had just suggested. "Elaborate," Vextar said simply. Sarah moved closer to the tactical display, pointing at the swarm's movement patterns. "Look at their behavior. They don't attack strategically. They consume everything in a straight line. They're not trying to defeat your fleets. They're trying to process biomass. Every time you engage them directly, you're feeding them more materials to work with. The Void Swarm converts destroyed ships into more swarm units." Sub-Commander Kexmol agreed reluctantly. "But retreating is not a viable long-term strategy. They will eventually consume all inhabited systems." I'm not talking about retreating, Sarah said, her mind racing as patterns began to emerge from the data. I'm talking about changing the game entirely. What if instead of trying to destroy them, we made ourselves indigestible? The concept translator built into Sarah's communication implant struggled with the term, producing a series of confused bleeps and whistles in Zephyrian. She tried again. What I mean is, what if we turned their feeding behavior against them, made them want to go somewhere else? Fleet Commander Vexstar approached the display, his massive form casting a shadow over Sarah. You suggest we redirect them? I suggest we give them something better to eat, Sarah said, her confidence growing as the idea took shape. The swarm follows biomass concentrations and energy signatures, right? What if we created a more attractive target? Kexmal consulted his displays. The largest biomass concentration in this sector is the Zerion system. 16 billion inhabitants across 4 worlds. You cannot seriously suggest we sacrifice an entire star system. Not sacrifice, Sarah corrected. Evacuate. Strip every bit of technology and evacuate every living being. Then we seed the system with something that looks like the biggest, most delicious biomass signature the swarm has ever encountered. The bridge was silent for a long moment. Sarah could practically hear the gears turning in their highly evolved brains as they processed her suggestion. Even if such a thing were possible, Vexstar said slowly, the logistics alone would be staggering. Evacuating 4 worlds in time, the Zerion system is only 47 light-years from here, Sarah interrupted. With your quantum tunnel technology, you could have the entire population relocated within 36 hours. The real challenge is creating the bait. Subcommander Kexmal's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of either deep thought or extreme agitation. What kind of bait could possibly be more attractive to the swarm than a living star system? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since arriving in the sector, she felt like she might actually be useful. What's the most energy-dense, biomass-rich thing in the galaxy? A compressed biosphere, Kexmal replied automatically. Theoretical constructs that could sustain billions of life forms in a space no larger than a small moon. But such technology is purely conceptual. No civilization has ever successfully created one. Because no civilization has ever had a good enough reason, Sarah said. But we do now. And more importantly, we don't actually need to create one. We just need to make the swarm think we have. Fleet Commander Vexstar's 4 eyes focused on Sarah with renewed intensity. You propose to create a false biomass signature massive enough to redirect an entire swarm. Even if such a deception were possible, how would we prevent them from discovering the truth once they arrive? Sarah's smile widened. This was the part she was most excited about because it was the most completely insane idea she had ever had. We don't prevent them from discovering the truth. We make sure they're too busy to care. Before anyone could ask what she meant, the ship's combat alerts began blaring. New contacts were appearing on the edge of sensor range. Another swarm tendril, larger than anything they had encountered before. Status report, Vexstar commanded. Massive swarm formation approaching from Vector 77 Mark IV, came the reply from the sensor station. Estimated composition, 4,000 individual units, including what appears to be a command organism. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. A command organism was something they had only theorized about, a central intelligence that coordinated swarm activities across multiple star systems. If one was here, it meant the swarm was no longer operating on instinct alone. Time to contact? Vexstar asked. 17 hours at current velocity. The fleet commander straightened to his full imposing height. Signal all remaining vessels. Prepare for final engagement. We will make our stand here. Sir, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the preparation orders being issued across the bridge. Give me 12 hours. Vexstar paused. For what? To prove that humans don't know how to lose. The Zephyrian commander studied her for a long moment, his 4 eyes taking in every detail of her small, unremarkable human form. Sarah knew what he was seeing, a representative of a species so new to galactic civilization that they still used chemical rockets for some of their space travel. A being from a world that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, a creature whose species was known primarily for being aggressively curious and completely unpredictable. 12 hours, Vexstar said finally, but Lieutenant Chen, understand this. When those 12 hours are over, we fight. And we will almost certainly die. I hope your plan is worth our lives. Sarah nodded, already running calculations in her head. 12 hours to save galactic civilization using nothing but human stubbornness, and what was probably the craziest idea anyone had ever had. She had faced worse odds before, like the time she had convinced her academy instructors to let her graduate despite failing their impossible final exam. Of course, that had only involved her own career. This time, if she failed, the galaxy would probably end. No pressure, she muttered to herself as she headed for the communications array. She had some very interesting calls to make. Behind her, the bridge of the Dominance erupted into activity as officers began preparing for what they believed would be their final battle. None of them noticed the small human smile playing at Sarah's lips, the expression of someone who had just figured out how to cheat at an unwinnable game. The Void Swarm had consumed 17 star systems by following predictable patterns and overwhelming force, but they had never encountered anything like human creativity backed by galactic technology. They were about to learn that some species didn't just adapt to impossible situations. They rewrite the rules entirely. In 12 hours, Sarah Chen would either save the galaxy or get everyone killed trying. For a human, those seemed like pretty good odds. Sarah's fingers flew across the quantum communication array with a familiarity that surprised the Zephyrian technicians watching her. Most species required weeks of training to operate alien technology, but humans had a peculiar talent for making foreign systems work through pure determination and creative button-pushing. This is Lieutenant Sarah Chen of the Terran Expeditionary Force, broadcasting on emergency channels to all vessels in the Andromeda sector. She spoke into the translator interface. I need to speak with anyone crazy enough to try something that's never been done before. Sub-Commander Kexmal observed from beside the communication station, his bioluminescent patches flickering in patterns that suggested deep skepticism. Lieutenant, most surviving vessels have already withdrawn to defensive positions around their homeworlds. I doubt anyone will respond to such an unconventional request. Sarah smiled. Kexmal clearly didn't understand how humans operated. When everyone else was running away from danger, humans had a tendency to run toward it, especially if someone told them it was impossible. The first response came within 3 minutes. "This is Captain Thrix of the independent cargo vessel Profit Margin," crackled through the speakers in heavily accented galactic standard. "Did someone just ask for crazy? Because I've got a ship full of Korathan refugees and nowhere safe to take them. What kind of crazy are we talking about?" Sarah's grin widened. "The kind that might get everyone killed but could save the galaxy. Are you interested? Lady, I've been hauling cargo through war zones for 20 years. Getting killed while saving the galaxy sounds like the best deal I've heard all month. What do you need?" Before Sarah could respond, more signals began flooding in. The communication array lit up like a festival display as dozens of vessels responded. Independent traders, mercenary groups, scientific research ships, and even a few military units that had gone silent rather than officially retreat. "This is Dr. Yilks of the Research Vessel Hypothesis," came another transmission. "I have been monitoring swarm behavior patterns for 6 months. If you have a plan that requires understanding their biology, I volunteer my services." "Mining consortium ship Bedrock here," added another voice. "We've got industrial fabrication equipment and enough raw materials to build a small space station. Also, my crew thinks your idea sounds insane enough to work." Sarah looked at Kexmal, whose bioluminescent patches were now cycling through patterns she had never seen before. "How many vessels have responded?" 47 and counting, Kexmal replied, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Including several ships I believed were destroyed." "How did they know to respond to your transmission?" "They didn't know anything," Sarah said, fielding another incoming communication. "They just heard someone asking for help with an impossible mission, and they couldn't resist finding out what it was about." "It's a very human trait, but apparently it's not limited to humans." Fleet Commander Vexstar approached the communication station, his massive form moving with the careful precision of someone trying not to break anything important. "Lieutenant Chen, you now have the attention of a significant portion of the sector's remaining independent vessels. What exactly do you intend to do with them?" Sarah pulled up the tactical display and began highlighting various points throughout local space. "We're going to build the biggest, most convincing fake biomass signature in galactic history. And we're going to do it in a place where the swarm will have no choice but to investigate." She pointed to a system roughly halfway between the approaching swarm and the Zerion system, a dead star surrounded by the remnants of what had once been a thriving civilization. "The graveyard system," Vexstar observed, "destroyed by stellar collapse 2 centuries ago. No life signs, no energy signatures, no strategic value whatsoever." "Exactly," Sarah said. "Which makes it the perfect place to hide something that shouldn't exist." "Dr. Yilks, are you still listening?" "Yes, Lieutenant Chen. I am fascinated by your proposal. I need to know everything about how the swarm detects biomass. What kind of energy signatures attract them? What tells them that something is worth consuming? There was a pause as the research vessel's sensors presumably accessed their databanks. The swarm appears to be attracted to several specific indicators: high concentrations of organic compounds, electromagnetic signatures consistent with neural activity, and quantum fluctuations associated with living consciousness. The larger and more complex the signature, the more attractive it becomes. Sarah nodded, pieces of the plan falling into place in her mind. Can those signatures be artificially generated? Theoretically, yes. But creating a false signature large enough to redirect an entire swarm would require energy outputs comparable to a small star. What if we didn't create one large signature, but thousands of smaller ones that appeared to be connected? Dr. Yilks's excitement was audible even through the translation matrix. A distributed biomass network. Yes, that could work. If we created thousands of interconnected false signatures across the graveyard system, the swarm would read it as a single massive organism. Captain Thrix's voice crackled through the speakers. Doc, how much equipment would something like that take? Significant industrial fabrication capabilities, quantum processing arrays, and enough power generation to... Dr. Yilks paused. Wait, the graveyard system's dead star is a neutron star. If we could tap into its rotational energy... Now you're thinking like a human, Sarah said approvingly. Captain of the Bedrock! How long would it take your fabrication equipment to build quantum resonance beacons if we provided the specifications? About 3,000. The communication channel went silent for a moment. Sarah could practically hear the mining captain running calculations. 3,000 quantum resonance beacons if we stripped every piece of non-essential equipment from every ship in this improvised fleet and used it as raw materials, maybe 14 hours. But that's assuming we have somewhere to actually build them. Sarah looked at Fleet Commander Vexstar. How fast can Zephyrian construction drones work? Our automated construction systems can assemble a basic space station in approximately 6 hours, Vexstar replied slowly, his 4 eyes still focused on the tactical display. But Lieutenant, even if this plan succeeds in redirecting the swarm, what prevents them from simply continuing toward inhabited systems once they discover the deception? This was the part of the plan that Sarah had been working on since she first had the idea. It was also the part that made her slightly queasy to think about. We don't let them discover the deception, she said. At least, not until it's too late for them to change course. She manipulated the tactical display to show the graveyard system in detail, highlighting the neutron star at its center. A neutron star has a gravitational field strong enough to trap anything that gets too close, including the swarm. But they'll only approach if they think there's something worth consuming. Subcommander Kexmal's mandibles clicked rapidly. You propose to use the neutron star as a gravitational trap. But how do you maintain the illusion long enough for the entire swarm to become committed to the approach? Sarah's smile took on a slightly manic quality by giving them something real to consume. The bridge fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. Lieutenant Fleet Commander Vexstar said carefully, What exactly do you mean by something real? The swarm is attracted to consciousness and neural activity, Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. The biggest source of both in this sector is this combined fleet. So we park ourselves in the graveyard system, surrounded by thousands of fake biomass signatures, and wait for them to come to us. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the ship's systems and the distant sound of someone dropping something heavy on the deck below. You want to use the entire fleet as bait, Kexmal said slowly. I want to use the entire fleet as the ultimate bait, Sarah corrected. Real consciousness signatures surrounded by fake ones, all positioned near a gravitational trap that the swarm won't be able to escape once they're committed. By the time they realize the deception, they'll be too close to the neutron star to change course. Captain Thrix's voice came through the speakers with something that might have been admiration. That's either the most brilliant tactical plan I've ever heard, or the most elaborate suicide mission in galactic history. Why not both? Sarah replied cheerfully. Dr. Yilks's transmission crackled with excitement. The plan could work. If we position the fake signatures correctly, create enough quantum interference to mask the true nature of the fleet signatures, and maintain the illusion for approximately 47 hours. 47 hours? Fleet Commander Vexstar interrupted. The approaching swarm formation will reach us in less than 17 hours. That's why we're not waiting for them here, Sarah said. We're going to the graveyard system now, building our trap, and letting them come to us. By the time they arrive, everything will be in place. She began issuing coordinates to the assembled fleet. All vessels, plot course for the graveyard system. We have 12 hours to build the most convincing fake ecosystem in galactic history, and then we're going to sit in the middle of it and dare the Void Swarm to come and get us." "And if they do?" asked someone Sarah didn't recognize. "Then we find out if a bunch of crazy volunteers can outthink a force that's devoured 17 star systems," Sarah replied. "But honestly, I like our odds. Humans have a pretty good track record when it comes to impossible situations." As the Dominance began altering course toward the dead system, Sarah couldn't help but feel a familiar thrill. This was exactly the kind of completely insane plan that had gotten her through Academy, earned her a commission in the Expeditionary Force, and somehow landed her on the bridge of an alien dreadnought planning the defense of galactic civilization. It was also exactly the kind of plan that would either make her a legend or get everyone killed. For a human, those seemed like pretty good odds. Behind her, she could hear Zephyrian officers coordinating with the improvised fleet, their voices carrying a tone she hadn't heard before. It wasn't quite hope. The situation was still far too desperate for that. But it wasn't resignation either. It was the sound of people who had been given one last chance to fight back and were determined to make it count. The Void Swarm had never encountered anything like coordinated desperation backed by human stubbornness. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The graveyard system looked exactly like its name suggested, a stellar cemetery where broken worlds orbited a dead star like mourners around a grave. The neutron star at the center pulsed with deadly radiation, its gravitational field so intense that it had compressed the matter of an entire sun into a sphere barely 20 kilometers across. Sarah stood on the observation deck of the Dominance, watching through filtered viewports as dozens of ships swarmed through the system like industrious insects. Construction drones buzzed between vessels, carrying raw materials and partially assembled components. The improvised fleet had been working for 8 hours straight, and the results were beginning to take shape. "Status report," Fleet Commander Vextar requested as he joined Sarah at the viewport. "Remarkable progress, considering we're essentially building a fake ecosystem from scratch," Sarah replied, consulting the datapad she had been using to coordinate construction efforts. "The Bedrock's fabrication teams have completed 2,700 quantum resonance beacons. Dr. Yulks's research vessel has successfully tapped into the neutron star's rotational energy using modified mining equipment. And Captain Thrix somehow convinced a cargo hauler to sacrifice their entire shipment of luxury goods to provide rare elements for the consciousness simulators." Vextar's four eyes tracked the movement of construction teams across the system. "And the false biomass signatures?" "That's the beautiful part," Sarah said, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. "We don't need to create fake biomass. We just need to make real biomass look like something else. Every ship in the fleet is broadcasting modified life signs that make our actual crew look like a distributed alien organism." She pointed to a cluster of vessels near the system's edge. "Those 12 ships are configured to appear as neural clusters, the brain centers of our fake ecosystem. The mining ships are broadcasting as digestive organs. The research vessels are masquerading as sensory arrays. From the swarm's perspective, we look like a single massive organism that's somehow taken root in a dead star system. And when they arrive to investigate, they'll find exactly what they're looking for, a huge concentration of biomass and consciousness, apparently connected in ways they've never seen before. By the time they realize it's actually just a fleet full of real people pretending to be something else, they'll be too committed to the approach vector to escape the neutron star's gravity well." Vextar studied the tactical display with the careful attention of someone who had spent 3,000 years learning to spot flaws in battle plans. "The deception is elegant, but it depends on the swarm behaving predictably. What if they detect the true nature of our fleet before entering the gravity trap?" Sarah had been wondering the same thing. The plan relied on the swarm's apparent inability to distinguish between natural and artificial biosignatures, but they were dealing with a force that had consumed 17 star systems. They had to have learned something from all that destruction. "That's where the command organism comes in," she said, pulling up sensor readings from the approaching swarm. "Yulks's analysis suggests that the command organism coordinates swarm behavior through some kind of distributed intelligence network. It makes decisions based on data from thousands of smaller units. And distributed intelligence networks have a weakness that no individual consciousness has. They can be overwhelmed by contradictory information. If we give the command organism too much data to process all at once, it might default to basic programmed behaviors." Vextar's expression shifted to what Sarah had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of skeptical interest. "Explain. We're not just creating one false biomass signature, we're creating thousands of them, all slightly different, all broadcasting different types of life signs." The command organism will try to analyze every single one to determine threat levels and feeding priorities. While it's busy processing all that data, the individual swarm units will fall back on their basic instinct, move toward the largest concentration of biomass. Which is us, surrounded by enough fake signals to make the command organism think we're the find of the millennium. A new voice interrupted their conversation. Lieutenant Chen, this is Dr. Yilks. You need to see what we've discovered about the swarm's approach pattern. Sarah activated the communication link. What have you found, Doctor? The command organism is not behaving as we predicted. It has divided the approaching swarm into 3 separate formations, each approaching from a different vector. They appear to be planning a coordinated assault rather than a simple feeding approach. Sarah felt her stomach drop. A coordinated attack suggested intelligence beyond what they had assumed. If the swarm was capable of complex tactical thinking, their deception plan might not work at all. How much time do we have? She asked. First formation will reach the edge of the system in approximately 4 hours. All 3 formations will converge on our position in 6 hours. Sarah closed her eyes and ran through the tactical situation in her mind. 3 separate formations meant the swarm could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. It also meant that if their deception failed, the fleet would be surrounded with no escape route. But it also meant something else, something that might actually work in their favor. Doctor, are the 3 formations maintaining communication with each other? Yes, we're detecting significant quantum entanglement signatures between the formations. They appear to be sharing tactical data in real time. Sarah opened her eyes and found Fleet Commander Vexstar watching her with intense curiosity. You have an idea, he observed. I have a terrible idea that might actually work better than the original plan, Sarah said, moving quickly toward the communication array. All vessels, this is Chen. Change of plans. We're not just building a fake ecosystem. We're building a trap that uses their intelligence against them. She began rapidly inputting new coordinates into the fleet's positioning system. Dr. Yilks, I need you to modify the quantum resonance beacons to create interference patterns that will disrupt quantum entanglement communication. That would sever the connection between the swarm formations, Dr. Yilks replied. They would lose their coordination advantage. Exactly. But more importantly, it would force the command organism to choose either maintain its tactical coordination and stay outside the interference field, or investigate the biomass signatures and lose contact with its formations. Sub-Commander Kexmal approached the communication station, his bioluminescent patches flickering with patterns Sarah was beginning to recognize as excitement. You propose to exploit their command structure against them. I propose to give them a choice between staying smart or staying together, Sarah corrected. And then I'm going to make sure that either choice leads them into our trap. She began issuing new positioning orders to the fleet. Instead of clustering near the neutron star, she spread the ships throughout the system in a complex 3D pattern that would force the swarm formations to commit to specific approach vectors. If they choose to maintain formation coherence, they'll be forced to approach from predictable angles, making them vulnerable to concentrated fire from our defensive positions. If they choose to investigate the biomass signatures, they'll lose coordination just as they enter the gravitational trap. Fleet Commander Vexstar studied the new fleet positioning with growing appreciation. You are creating multiple failure modes for the enemy. No matter how they choose to attack, they face disadvantages. I'm creating a situation where their strengths become weaknesses, Sarah said. Their intelligence makes them cautious, which slows their approach and gives us more time to prepare. Their coordination requires communication, which we can disrupt. Their feeding instincts make them predictable once they lock on to a target. Captain Trix's voice crackled through the speakers. Chen, your new positioning has my cargo haulers scattered across half the system. If this goes wrong, we're going to be picked off one by one. If this goes wrong, we were all dead anyway, Sarah replied. But if it goes right, we're about to teach the Void Swarm that some prey fights back. As the fleet moved into its new positions, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of terror and exhilaration that came with implementing a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. She had committed 47 ships and several thousand lives to a strategy that depended on enemy behavior she could only guess at. But that was the thing about impossible situations. You didn't win them by playing it safe. You won them by doing something so unexpected that the enemy couldn't adapt fast enough to counter it. Lieutenant, Fleet Commander Vexstar said quietly, I have commanded fleets for over 2 centuries. I have never seen a tactical plan that so completely abandons conventional military doctrine. Is that good or bad? Sarah asked. I suspect we are about to find out. But I will say this. If your plan succeeds, it will redefine how warfare is conducted in this galaxy. And if it fails, then we will all die knowing we tried something that had never been attempted before. For a warrior, that is not the worst possible fate. Sarah nodded, watching as the last ships moved into position. The improvised fleet was now spread across the graveyard system like a three-dimensional web, with quantum resonance beacons creating interference patterns that would disrupt enemy communications while making their own false biosignatures appear more convincing. In 4 hours, they would discover whether human tactical thinking could outmaneuver a force that had devoured 17 star systems. In 6 hours, they would either be celebrating the most unlikely victory in galactic history or providing the Void Swarm with their biggest meal yet. For now, all they could do was wait and hope that sometimes being completely insane was the same thing as being completely brilliant. The approaching swarm had never encountered prey that fought back with such aggressive creativity. They were about to learn that humans didn't just survive impossible situations, they turned those situations into weapons against their enemies. The first swarm formation entered the graveyard system like a living storm cloud, thousands of biomechanical entities flowing through space in patterns that defied conventional physics. Sarah watched from the Dominance's bridge as her sensors struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. Creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, their forms shifting between solid matter and pure energy. "Contact confirmed," Subcommander Kexmal reported, his voice tight with controlled tension. First formation consists of approximately 2,000 units. They are maintaining approach vector toward the outer beacon clusters. "And their communication status?" Sarah asked, monitoring the quantum interference patterns her modified resonance beacons were creating throughout the system. "Quantum entanglement signals between formations are degrading as expected, Doctor." Yolks' voice crackled through the communication array. "The command organism is attempting to compensate by increasing transmission power, but our interference field is preventing coherent data transfer." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction. The first part of her plan was working. The swarm formations were losing their tactical coordination just as they entered the system, but the real test would come when they encountered the false biosignatures. "Sir," the sensor operator called out, "the lead formation is changing behavior. They're spreading out and beginning detailed scans of the beacon clusters." Fleet Commander Vexstar moved to stand beside Sarah at the tactical display. They are not rushing toward the largest biomass concentration as predicted. They appear to be investigating individual signatures. Sarah frowned, watching the swarm units spread through the outer system like investigators at a crime scene. This wasn't the mindless feeding behavior they had observed in previous encounters. Even without coordination from the command organism, these things were showing tactical intelligence. "Dr. Yilks, what's the status on Formations 2 and 3? Formation 2 has entered the system from the opposite vector and is beginning similar scanning behavior. Formation 3... There was a pause. "Formation 3 has not entered the system. They appear to be maintaining position outside our sensor range." Sarah's blood went cold. A force that kept reserves while conducting reconnaissance was demonstrating military thinking far beyond what they had anticipated. The Void Swarm wasn't just an intelligent predator. It was a tactical opponent that learned from every encounter. "They're being careful," she said, more to herself than to the bridge crew. "The question," Fleet Commander Vexstar observed, "is whether they are being careful because they suspect a trap, or because they have learned to thoroughly investigate new food sources before consuming them." The answer came 15 minutes later when the lead swarm units reached the first cluster of quantum resonance beacons. Instead of the feeding frenzy Sarah had expected, the creatures began a methodical analysis of each artificial signature, testing them with energy probes that her sensors could barely detect. "They're not buying it," Captain Thrix's voice came through the communication array with obvious concern. "These things know the difference between real biomass and fake signals." Sarah watched in growing horror as swarm units methodically exposed beacon after beacon as artificial constructs. Her carefully crafted deception was falling apart in real time, and she had no backup plan. "Lieutenant Chen," Dr. Yilks' urgent transmission cut through her rising panic. "I'm detecting massive quantum fluctuations from the command organism's position. It appears to be attempting to reestablish communication with the advanced formations." That gave Sarah an idea. A desperate, probably suicidal idea, but an idea nonetheless. "All ships, this is Chen," she broadcast to the entire fleet. "Prepare to implement Emergency Protocol 7. Lieutenant Fleet Commander Vexstar said carefully. "There is no Emergency Protocol 7. There is now," Sarah replied, her fingers flying over the communication controls. All vessels on my signal drop all stealth measures and begin broadcasting maximum life sign signatures. I want every consciousness in this fleet to light up like a supernova. Sub-Commander Kexmal's mandibles clicked in alarm. That will expose our true positions to the entire swarm. We will lose all tactical advantage. We're going to lose anyway if they figure out our deception, Sarah said grimly. But if we suddenly appear as a massive concentration of real biomass right in the middle of their investigation, understanding dawned in Fleet Commander Vextar's four eyes. You propose to trigger their feeding instincts while they are dispersed and out of communication with their command organism. I propose to make ourselves so attractive that they forget to be careful, Sarah said. Yilks. Can you jam the command organism's communication attempts for, say, 10 minutes? I can overload their quantum transmission arrays with a focused interference burst, but it will require shutting down our own communications and most of our defensive systems. Sarah took a deep breath. Everything was about to depend on timing, luck, and the assumption that even intelligent predators could be driven to act irrationally by the promise of an easy meal. Do it. The effect was immediate and terrifying. As the fleet dropped its stealth measures and began broadcasting concentrated life signs, the scattered swarm formations suddenly stopped their methodical investigation and began moving with obvious purpose toward the center of the system where the largest ships were positioned. It's working, Sub-Commander Kexmal reported, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Both advanced formations are abandoning their scanning operations and moving toward our position. Time to contact? Sarah asked. First units will reach our perimeter in approximately 12 minutes. Sarah felt her heart racing as she watched thousands of alien predators streaming toward their position. The next few minutes would determine whether her desperate gamble saved the galaxy or provided the Void Swarm with their biggest feast yet. All ships prepare defensive positions, Fleet Commander Vextar ordered. Remember, we only need to hold them for long enough to draw them into the gravitational trap. Sir, the sensor operator called out, Formation 3 has entered the system. They're approaching on a direct intercept course. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the tactical situation. 3 separate swarm formations were converging on the fleet's position, drawn by the promise of massive biomass concentrations. But they were approaching from different vectors, which meant they're going to hit the neutron star's gravity well at different times, she realized. If we can time this right, we can use their own approach vectors against them. She began rapidly calculating orbital mechanics in her head, factoring in the neutron star's gravitational field and the momentum of the approaching formations. Fleet repositioning order, she announced. All ships, prepare to execute a coordinated drift toward the neutron star. We're going to use its gravity to accelerate our escape velocity while the swarm gets caught in the gravity well. That's assuming we survive the next 10 minutes, Captain Thrix pointed out. One crisis at a time, Sarah replied, watching as the first swarm units entered weapons range. All ships, you are authorized to fire at will. Let's give them something to think about besides lunch. The space around the graveyard system erupted into chaos as 47 ships opened fire simultaneously on the approaching swarm formations. Energy beams, projectile weapons, and exotic particle streams created a light show visible from several star systems away. But the swarm responded with weapons of their own. Biological energy projectors that could melt through hull armor, gravity manipulation devices that could crush a ship like an empty can, and something that Dr. Yilks would later describe as weaponized entropy. Hull breach on Deck 7, came a damage report from somewhere on the Dominance. The cargo hauler Persistence is reporting total engine failure, Sub-Commander Kexmal added. Formation 2 has broken through our outer defensive perimeter, the sensor operator announced. Sarah watched the tactical display as their defensive line began to crumble under the swarm's assault. They had drawn the enemy into their trap, but they still had to survive long enough for the trap to close. Dr. Yilks, status on the command organism's communications? Still jammed, but I'm detecting attempts to establish direct physical contact with the advanced formations. The command organism appears to be moving into the system itself. That changed everything. If the command organism entered the system, it could potentially coordinate the swarm's escape from the gravity trap, but it also presented an opportunity that Sarah couldn't ignore. All ships, new target priority, she announced. Ignore the advanced formations and concentrate all fire on the command organism the moment it enters weapons range. If we can disable their coordination, the entire swarm becomes vulnerable. Lieutenant, Fleet Commander Vextar said quietly, that entity is larger than most space stations and protected by thousands of escort units. Even concentrated fire from our entire fleet may not be sufficient to damage it. Sarah smiled grimly. Then we're going to have to get creative. She opened a communication channel to the mining ship Bedrock. Captain, do you still have any of those industrial explosives you mentioned earlier? About 12 tons of them. Why? How would you feel about ramming the biggest target in galactic history? The communication channel went silent for a moment. Then Captain Thrix's voice came through with something that might have been laughter. Chen, you are absolutely insane. I love it. As the battle raged around them and the swarm formations closed in from 3 directions, Sarah began coordinating what was probably the most ridiculous military operation in galactic history. If it worked, they would save civilization through a combination of physics, explosives, and pure human stubbornness. If it didn't work, at least they would go out with a bang that the galaxy would remember for centuries. The command organism was about to learn that some species didn't just fight back. They fought back with style. The command organism emerged from quantum space like a nightmare made manifest. A biomechanical construct the size of a small moon, its surface writhing with what appeared to be millions of smaller entities that served as both armor and weapon systems. Sarah had seen recordings of swarm entities before, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer presence of the thing that coordinated their activities across multiple star systems. Proximity alert, Sub-Commander Kexmal announced, his voice steady despite the massive entity bearing down on their position. Command organism will enter optimal weapons range in 3 minutes. Status on our mining ship, volunteers? Sarah asked, dividing her attention between the tactical display and the communication array. The Bedrock is loaded with industrial explosives and ready for ramming speed, Captain Thrix reported. The Deep Strike and Ore Hunter are standing by to provide escort. Fair warning, though, we're talking about hitting something that's probably tougher than most planetary surfaces. Sarah nodded grimly. Her plan depended on the assumption that even the command organism had vulnerable points, areas where its biological and mechanical components interfaced in ways that could be disrupted by sufficient kinetic energy. Dr. Yilks, have you identified any potential weak points in the target's structure? The entity appears to have several large apertures that serve as communication arrays, the researcher replied. If we could deliver an explosive payload directly into one of those apertures, it would be like shooting a bullet through its brain, Sarah finished. Bedrock, did you hear that? Copy that. We're adjusting approach vector to target the largest communication aperture. This is going to be fun. Fleet Commander Vexstar moved to stand beside Sarah at the tactical display. Even if this assault succeeds in disabling the command organism, we still face 3 swarm formations totaling over 6,000 units. How do we deal with them once their coordination is disrupted? Sarah pointed to the neutron star at the center of the system. We don't fight them. We let physics do the work for us. She manipulated the display to show gravitational field lines and orbital mechanics calculations. The swarm formations are approaching from 3 different vectors, but they're all converging on our position near the neutron star. Once the command organism is disabled, they'll lose tactical coordination and fall back on basic feeding instincts, which means they will continue toward the largest biomass concentration, Vexstar observed. Which means they'll follow us as we execute a powered orbit around the neutron star, Sarah continued. But here's the thing about neutron star gravity wells. They're extremely unforgiving to objects that don't know exactly what they're doing. Sub-Commander Kexmal's bioluminescent patches flickered with understanding. You propose to use the neutron star as a weapon. Lead the swarm formations into an orbital trajectory they cannot escape. I propose to use the swarm's own feeding instincts to trap them in a gravity well that will tear them apart, Sarah said. But first we need to remove their ability to think their way out of it. The Bedrock began its attack run just as the first swarm escort units entered weapons range. The mining ship was built for durability rather than speed, but what it lacked in grace it made up for in sheer stubborn momentum. Industrial-grade armor plating deflected energy beams that would have vaporized smaller vessels, while its escort ships laid down covering fire to clear a path through the defensive screens surrounding the command organism. Bedrock is taking heavy fire, Captain Thrix reported. Hull integrity holding at 70% and dropping. Sir, the sensor operator called out, massive energy buildup detected within the command organism. It appears to be preparing some kind of primary weapon. Sarah felt her heart skip. If the command organism had weapons capable of destroying the entire fleet, her plan would fail before it even had a chance to work. All ships, emergency scatter pattern, Fleet Commander Vexstar ordered. Do not present a concentrated target. But the command organism's weapon wasn't aimed at the fleet. Instead, it fired a massive energy pulse directly at the neutron star itself, causing space-time to ripple like water disturbed by a thrown stone. Gravitational anomaly detected, Dr. Yilks's voice cracked through the communication array with obvious excitement and terror. The command organism is attempting to destabilize the neutron star's rotation. If successful, it will create a gravitational shockwave that will destroy everything in the system. Sarah stared at the tactical display in horror. The command organism wasn't just intelligent. It was intelligent enough to recognize their trap and turn it against them. In trying to use the neutron star as a weapon against the swarm, they had given the enemy a way to destroy them all. But then she noticed something else in the gravitational readings, something that gave her one last desperate idea. Dr. Yilks, what happens if the neutron star's rotation is destabilized while something large is caught in its gravity well? The resulting gravitational chaos would... Oh my. Lieutenant, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that if the command organism wants to turn our trap against us, we let it, Sarah said, opening a channel to the bedrock. Change of mission parameters. Don't try to destroy the command organism. Just get close enough to make sure it can't escape when its own weapon backfires. Copy that, came the reply, switching to intercept and grapple maneuvers. Sarah turned to Fleet Commander Vexstar. Sir, I need you to order a general retreat. Every ship in the fleet needs to get to minimum safe distance from the neutron star in the next 90 seconds. And leave the command organism free to destabilize the star? And make sure that when it does, it's the only thing close enough to get caught in the gravitational chaos, Sarah said grimly. Sometimes the best way to win is to let your enemy destroy himself while you get out of the way. The next 60 seconds were a masterpiece of controlled chaos as 46 ships executed a coordinated retreat from the neutron star while the bedrock closed on the command organism. The mining ship's captain had apparently decided that if he was going to die, he might as well make it memorable. The bedrock approached the massive entity like a terrier attacking a bear, using industrial grabbing arms to latch onto the command organism's communication arrays. Bedrock to fleet. Captain Thrix's voice came through the speakers with surprising calm. We're locked on and not going anywhere. Whatever you're planning, you better do it fast. The command organism's second energy pulse struck the neutron star with the force of a concentrated supernova. Space-time itself seemed to convulse as gravitational waves propagated outward from the destabilized stellar core. But instead of creating a shockwave that destroyed everything in the system, the neutron star's disrupted rotation began generating a gravitational maelstrom that pulled everything nearby into an inescapable spiral. Gravitational cascade confirmed, Dr. Yilts reported. The neutron star has become gravitationally unstable. Anything within 1.7 million kilometers will be drawn in and compressed beyond molecular cohesion. Distance to the command organism? Sarah asked. 1.6 million kilometers and decreasing rapidly. The bedrock's grappling action has prevented it from escaping the gravity well. Sarah watched the tactical display as the command organism, the intelligence that had coordinated the destruction of 17 star systems, was dragged inexorably toward the chaotic gravity field it had created. The entity's escort units tried desperately to break their leader free, but the combined mass of the command organism and the bedrock had already passed the point of no return. What about the other swarm formations? Fleet Commander Vexstar asked. Without coordination from the command organism, they're reverting to basic feeding behaviors, Sarah observed as scattered swarm units throughout the system began moving toward the gravitational maelstrom. They're following their instincts straight into the trap. Over the next hour, they watched as the Void Swarm, the force that had seemed unstoppable just days before, was systematically consumed by the very weapon they had tried to turn against their enemies. The neutron star's chaotic gravity field pulled in swarm formation after swarm formation, compressing the biomechanical entities beyond any possibility of survival or reconstruction. When the gravitational cascade finally stabilized, the graveyard system lived up to its name in a way that no one had ever intended. The neutron star had consumed the entire Void Swarm force, leaving behind only scattered debris and a significantly more massive stellar remnant. Final status report, Sub-Commander Kexmol announced to the bridge with something approaching awe. No swarm entities detected within sensor range. The command organism has been completely destroyed. All allied vessels accounted for except the bedrock, Sarah finished quietly. The communication array crackled with final transmission from the mining ship as it disappeared into the neutron star's event horizon. This is Captain Thrix of the Bedrock. If anyone's listening to this, tell my crew they were the best miners in the galaxy. And tell that crazy human that her plan actually worked. Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of silence for the crew that had sacrificed themselves to make victory possible. When she opened them again, Fleet Commander Vexstar was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. "Lieutenant Chen," he said formally, You have accomplished something that every military strategist in the galaxy believed to be impossible. You have defeated a force that seemed unstoppable through tactics that no conventional military doctrine would have recommended. I had help, Sarah said simply. A lot of help from people who were willing to try something insane because conventional wisdom wasn't working. Indeed, but it was human creativity that identified the solution. Human stubbornness that convinced others to attempt it, and human courage that saw it through to completion. Acting. Sarah looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, thinking about the 17 systems that had been consumed by the Void Swarm and the countless billions of lives that had been lost. The victory felt hollow in comparison to that massive tragedy. The swarm is gone, she said. But the damage they caused can't be undone. No, Fleet Commander Vexstar agreed. But because of what happened here today, no other systems will suffer the same fate. The galaxy will remember this battle not as the end of civilization, but as the moment when impossible became merely improbable. Over the following weeks, as news of the victory spread through galactic communication networks, Sarah found herself receiving messages from across the galaxy. Governments offered her positions, universities wanted to study her tactics, and military academies began incorporating human strategic thinking into their curricula. But the message that meant the most came from Earth. A simple transmission from Terran Command, congratulating her on completing her mission and informing her that humanity's application for full membership in the Galactic Alliance had been approved. Apparently, saving galactic civilization was considered adequate proof that humans could contribute meaningfully to the galactic community. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the Earth Defense Station, watching as ships from dozens of different species approached Earth for the formal membership ceremony. The galaxy had learned that humans brought something unique to the cosmic community, a willingness to attempt the impossible when conventional wisdom failed. It was, she reflected, a pretty good reputation to have. The battle had been unwinnable, right up until the moment that someone decided winning was more important than following the rules, and in the end, that had made all the difference.